To start off our class this month, I'm going to be demonstrating first the Lunaria seed pods. And Lunaria is also called honesty plant or money plant or silver dollar plant. And we're just making the seed pods from this plant. It actually has pink flowers and green leaves and everything. These are just the little seed pods. We're going to be working with the basic frame technique and also with lacing. Now for the colors, I am using a color E and F from the materials list. If you're looking at the materials list, those color E and F. Color E is a gilt-lined Miyuki bead. It's an opal white AB. And then for color F, this is going to be the outside edging around each little seed pods. This one is labeled as a bronze-lined clear from the store that I got it from, but it's not actually clear. I'm pretty sure it would be an alabaster or an opal finished bead made by Preciosa. So it's bronze-lined alabaster or opal white, but it's sold as a bronze-lined clear bead. Okay, now for the wire, we're going to need a 24 gauge and a 30 gauge wire, either in silver or white or off-white. Now there is not a 30 gauge white wire, but Parawire does make a 32 gauge antique white, which is what I usually use to lace white components. But for these ones, I just use silver because it works just fine with the beads that we're using. You're also going to want a ruler and then some wire cutters. And if you have them, some sort of pliers. I really like nylon jaw pliers so I don't risk breaking my beads. I'm not very gentle with my tools. So if you have regular pliers, those will be just fine too. You'll just have to be a little bit more gentle with them. Now, for the sake of the demo, I'm actually going to be switching these colors out because these colors and these wires do not play nicely with my camera and my lights. So we're going to be switching these out just again for the video demo to make sure that you guys can see very clearly what I'm doing on screen. So I'll be working with different colors of wire and different colors of beads, but your finished seed pods are going to look like this. First, I want to show you these little things. These are called spool tamers. They help so that your wire doesn't explode or come off the spool before you want it to. They're really fantastic to use if you can get your hands on one. They're really great, but they're not a necessity. Now, I'm working with 24 gauge wire here. That's what I'm going to be stringing my beads onto to actually make the petals, or seed pods. I make too many petals. I call everything petals. So we're going to just undo the end of our wire. And then take the very end of the wire, put it on the inside of the little plastic piece. There's a hole there. Slide your wire through that. And then we're going to fit the little elastic spool around the wire and kind of tighten it down so it holds tightly but isn't too tight. And that way when you need more wire, you can just pull out more wire. I think you're supposed to grab this little loop and pull it out, but I have no difficulties just holding the spool and pulling it out too. I'm going to demonstrate quickly how to use this bead spinner to string your beads onto the wire. Basically, I've just pulled out some wire off of my spool and I've straightened it really nicely. And then I'm going to just create a little curve right at the end. There's another shape that I'll show you here in just a little second, but this is the way that I use most of the time when I'm stringing my beads, is just kind of this wide hook here. You want to make sure that the very end of your wire has a nice clean cut on it. Sometimes the cutters don't cut very cleanly and you have a little bit of a bump or wiggle right there at the end of your wire that you will want to get rid of. Alright, now I'm going to insert my wire into my bead spinner kind of horizontally. I want the tip of my wire to just skim the very surface of the beads. If I go down too far into the beads, it's going to spray beads everywhere. So you'll want to go just skimming the surface. And I'm mostly horizontal but at a very slight angle here. Now my wire end is pointing this way. That means I want to spin my bowl this direction to get the wire or the beads to go onto my wire. So I'm just going to grab the little spindle at the top. Make sure my wire end is just skimming the surface of my beads. And I do keep my finger right here kind of at the base of the curve to provide a little bit more stability there. And then you'll dump those down the wire and then just continue stringing more. You don't want to go too fast at first, especially if you're just learning how to use a bead spinner. If you go too fast, your beads are going to fly everywhere. If you go really slowly, you might not spin very many beads on there. All right, let me show you another shape that you can turn this into. So if you straighten out your wire and then make a kind of a fish hook shape this way. Now you want to make sure that the very end of your wire is not curling in too far. Make sure it's kind of going out. So like this, like a little shepherd's crook or a little fish hook there right at the end of your wire. And you'll want to straighten out a little bit more of your wire down the line. And again, we're going to insert the wire into the bead spinner, but this time the end of my hook is kind of closer towards the edge of the bead spinner, right there. I'm at just enough of an angle so that the tip of my wire can go down toward the beads, but I'm still fairly horizontal in my bead spinner. And again, I want just the very end of the wire to skim the surface of the beads. I do not want to go down to the bottom of the bead spinner. Just skim the very surface, and this is going to catch the beads right at the edge of the bead spinner as the centrifugal force is going to force the beads out towards the edge of the bead spinner, and then they'll hop onto your wire. Now it does take a little bit of practice. I've been doing this for over a decade. I've been using these for over a decade, so I'm very well practiced on using a bead spinner. It usually does take a little bit of time to get used to them. You might need to play with the shape of your wire, the angle that you're putting it down into the beads. You might need to go straight up and down like this. Some people do it that way. That's fine. That works just well. You can move it around your bead spinner. So just play with the shape of your wire, play with the angles, play with your speeds until you can get those beads to go up onto your wire. All right, now I have 2 bead spinners, so I'm going to use 2 bead spinners. If you do not, you can also string beads by putting them in a little cup. And then again, you're going to make kind of a wide little hook arch shape there. And if you tip your bowl sideways to kind of get all the beads to go down to the bottom, you can string beads just by kind of stabbing into the beads over and over. It's a little bit slower than using a bead spinner, but it is better than stringing by hand. Now just a little wire management tip here if you're not used to working with wire. The first thing I do when I pull wire off of my spool is I run my fingers along it just to kind of straighten it out a little bit. Sometimes the wire likes to stay in the shape of the spool, and that makes it a little bit harder to manage and makes it more likely to form kinks while you're working. And that's really just unpleasant. So the first thing that I do is just kind of try to straighten it out so that it's easier to control. Now on my wire here, I've already strung. I've got a little over 15 inches. Didn't measure exactly here. Let's see what I got here. All right, so I've got about 17 inches of beads here on my spool of 24 gauge wire. And I'm going to work off of the spool until the point where I'm going to be switching colors in those outer rows. That way I don't have to worry about how much wire I need to make the main component. And I will show you guys how to switch those colors here at the end. Now we're making the large seed pod first here on camera, and then we'll talk about how the small one is a little bit different. Before I get started, I'm going to go ahead and cut my lacing wire now. I'm going to be lacing as you go in this demonstration, but you can lace afterwards if that is your preference. I just think that for most beginners, especially the lace as you go, helps you to get better results, so I'm going to be demonstrating that way here on camera. I've got some kind of wonky wire there at the end. All right, so I'm going to be using a 30 gauge wire to lace across my seed pods. This is, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it very well here on this little seed pod because it blends in really well with the silver wire here. But it's basically, I'm sewing straight across all of my rows to help hold them together. All right, so that's the wire that we're cutting right now. And let's see, for the large seed pods, we need somewhere around 4 inches. So I'm going to cut 4 inches off of the spool, and then I'm going to fold it in half. Just like that. And then I'm going to just kind of leave that off to the side until I'm ready to use that lacing wire. I do like to prepare these ahead of time because personally I don't like stopping wrapping my rows to prep a lacing wire. So I just like to have those ready at the beginning. If I have a bunch of components to make like we do for these seed pods, I do prep all of my lacing wires at the beginning. So we're going to be making 11 of the large ones that need the lacing. Lacing is optional in the small one, but we're going to have 11 of these larger seed pods that I'm about to make. So if you want to prepare all of your lacing wires ahead of time, you would cut 11 of those little wires and fold them all in half so that they're sitting nearby when you need to add them into your leaf or seed pod. Okay. Now we're working with the basic frame technique. So I'm going to make a little loop in the end of my wire that's just going to prevent my beads from falling off. On a basic frame pattern, it's going to tell you how many beads to use for your basic row. And for these seed pods, let me get in a little bit closer here. Now for the seed pods, our basic row is going to be 6 beads. So I'm going to count out 6 beads. When you're counting rows on a basic frame, the basic row is row number 1. Now for these seed pods, we need to leave our top wire about 2.5 inches long. We don't actually need that much length to make the top wire, but we do need a little bit of extra length there to make the little bead extensions on the top. It's a little bit easier to do those if you have a little bit more wire to handle. So we're going to leave about 2.5 inches up there at the top wire. And then we're going to be making the bottom loop. The bottom loop on these seed pods needs to be about a total length of 3 inches long when you're done making the loop. So we actually need to measure out somewhere around 6 inches of wire and then fold it in half. And we're going to cross it over right below the beads in our basic row. So it's going to come over the front, right below that basic row. And again, we're going to check the length to make sure we're somewhere around 3 inches of length there. Now I'm going to pinch and hold the basic row and this wire with one hand right there. And we're going to twist these 2 wires down a little ways. So I'm twisting and I'm opening up these wires at about the same angle away from the center point. That way I get a nice clean twist. Now you can always twist down further, but it is a little bit harder to untwist them. For this one, it's not a huge deal because we are going to be twisting the wires below to make the stem. So just twist down a little ways there. You can always twist more length as you need it for your rows. All right, now we're going to straighten this out. So I'm just going to grab this little wire up here with the top loop and the bottom loop, and I'm going to pull in opposite directions to kind of straighten everything out. Now let me go over here the parts of a basic frame because I am going to be using those terms here while we're making our little seed pod. We have, of course, right here in the middle our basic row, those 6 beads that we started with. That is row number 1. Right above the basic row is a single wire, which is going to be your top wire. That's the one with the little loop at the end to make sure that these basic row beads don't fall off. Right below the basic row is going to be the working wire. This is the one that has all of your beads on it. It should still be attached to your spool, so you have a continuous feed of both beads and wire to make your component. Below the working wire is a twisted wire that I call the bottom wire. And then there's the bottom loop down here. All right, so I've got color E strung onto my spool. The notes that I have say I actually need 15 inches of beads. I forgot to mention this earlier, but it said I needed 15 inches of beads. I strung 17. You should always string a little bit extra just because everybody uses a slightly different amount of beads. I'm thinking I might not even need the 15 inches of beads. I'm not sure how correct my notes are, so we're going to see exactly how much I used at the end. I'll tell you guys how much I had left over. Now we're going to be making 15 rows total on this seed pod. Rows in a basic frame are counted across. So this row right here is right in the middle is row number 1, and then row number 2 is going to be on this side, then row number 3, row 4, row 5, 6, 7, and all the way out till 15. So a full circuit around the basic row is actually 2 rows of beads. That's going to be really important while you're counting your rows. We're also going to be wrapping round bottom, round top. So I'm going to take row number 2 directly up beside row number 1. I'm going to kind of straighten out my beads. I do that just by running my thumb along them. That makes it just so that I get a nice clean row. And I also want to make sure that my row of beads is directly beside that basic row. I don't want a hole or a gap like this because that's going to create a hole in my little seed pod. So I'm going to squeeze those tight together, make sure they're close. And then I'm going to kind of pinch and hold right here to give me a little bit more control over my row and my beads. And I'm pushing down on my beads that are on the working wire. This is just going to help me to hold tension so I don't end up with holes and gaps between any of my beads. We are wrapping round bottom, round top. So this top means we're going to be wrapping at a 90-degree angle at the top wire and the bottom wire. So I'm going to take this working wire with all my beads over the front of the top wire. That's very important. Do not go around the back. Over the front, and I'm going to form kind of a 90-degree angle with the top wire and the basic row. Make sure that top wire is straight, and if it is not, quickly fix it by pulling it straight. So over the front at a 90-degree angle, and I'm going to measure my beads so that it is kind of right on top of or right in front of that top wire without going past it. So this bead right here, it's sitting on top of that top wire, but it is going past a little bit. So I'm going to eliminate that bead, and I'm going to measure my row just like that. I'm going to pinch and hold right here like this. That gives me more control over my top wire, more control over my row. It's going to help hold everything in place and give a little bit more support to my top wire while I'm wrapping. Now again, we're coming over the front of the top wire, and we're going to be wrapping at a 90-degree angle, which means we're going to maintain a flat wire or a 90-degree angle all the way around as we're wrapping. And I usually use my thumb kind of as an anchor point there to help hold that wire down to make sure that I have a nice flat wrap, which is what creates the rounded ends. So I'm going to use that as an anchor point, wrap around the back of that top wire, and then to the front again. Now at this point I'm going to add in my lacing wire. So I've got my little 30 gauge wire that I folded in half, and we're going to insert this into the front side of our little seed pod. You can tell the front from the back because the back should have more wire exposed. So that little wrap there, the back of the wrap will be exposed on the back side of the seed pod. So we're going to go into the front. Each of these little ends of the wire is going to go on opposite sides of that basic row, right there. And I'm going to pull all the way through so the little fold in the middle catches right between two beads, right in the middle of that basic row. So I've got 3 beads above and 3 beads below that little fold in my lacing wire. Now if you flip over to the back, I'm going to cross these wires so they switch places. That will make them loop around that basic row, like that. Now we're going to lace row 2 real quick. I'm going to flip this upside down. To lace, I'm going to bring the 30 gauge wire around the back side of the row, and then loop around the front and back down between those 2 rows. So I've made it kind of a full wrap around the row number 2. Pull that all the way through, and I want to make sure that my wire is going as straight across as I can. So I'm going to hold my thumbnail right in place where I want that wire to go between those beads, and then pull. All right. Now if you've laced properly, your lacing wire is only going to show on the back side of your seed pod where you went around the back first. The front side where you looped around should have gone all the way down between those beads and shouldn't show very much, if at all. All right, so there's row 2, and now we're going to add row 3. First thing I'm going to do is check to make sure that my beads are all the way down on my working wire so that they cover that top wire completely. If they haven't, if I've got something like this, I'm going to lift up the top wire, push down on them to make sure that I'm covering completely. Otherwise, I'll have kind of these little seams showing in the front side of my seed pod, which I definitely do not want to have. All right, I'm going to bring my row straight down beside that basic row. I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to pinch and push them close together because, again, I do not want gaps between my rows. I'm going to bring, before I even wrap at the bottom wire, I'm going to lace kind of mid-row here. So I'm going to pinch and hold that in place to make sure that I don't have any gaps forming between any of my beads. And I'm going to bring this lacing wire behind row 3. And I like to kind of just straighten my lacing wire as I go, just to help make sure that I don't have any kinks forming. And then again, we're going to wrap around the front of this row and down between this row number 3 and the row in front of it, or right beside it. So pull that all the way through, make sure that my loop goes right between 2 beads so that the lacing wire ends up fairly straight across the seed pod. All right, now I'm going to rotate my component because it's a little bit easier to wrap around the wire if it's pointing up. It's a little bit easier for me that way. I'm going to bring, again, we're wrapping round bottom, so I'm going to go over the front of the bottom wire at a 90-degree angle. I'm going to kind of pinch and hold that row in place while I'm measuring. Just helps so it doesn't kind of start cinching up and pulling on top of your seed pod. It makes it a little bit harder to measure out your row properly that way. So if you kind of pinch and hold that row in place, come over at a 90-degree angle, and we're going to measure again. I'm going to go right there. I'm going to eliminate that last bead right there just because it's going to sit a little bit funny. So I've got a 90-degree angle, and again, I'll wrap around the back and to the front again. All right, so at this point, I have wrapped rows 1, 2, and 3, and I'm going to continue wrapping in this color until I reach row 13. So we're going to go a little bit faster now and make sure that that bottom seam is covered down there, and if it's not, I'm going to kind of lift up my row and push them down so that my beads sit on top of that bottom wire. Wrap up the side directly beside the previous row of beads. You can kind of pull and tug on your working wire to make sure that your rows are nice and tight, and then you can also push in on the sides. Bring the lacing wire around the back side of that row and loop over the front down between row 4 and row 2. We just want to loop around just this one row down between 2 beads in that row. And I'm going to rotate my piece, and we're going to wrap at the top wire. Again, I've got a 90-degree angle wrap, so I'm going to measure my beads so that they are directly in front of or right on top of that top wire without going past it. Cross over the front of the top wire, always the front, at a 90-degree angle. I'm going to use my thumb as an anchor to kind of push down on my working wire so it stays at a 90-degree angle and I get a nice flat wrap around the back and then to the front again. So there's row 4 done, and then row 5 is going to go back down to the bottom wire. So again, I'm going to check and make sure that my top and bottom wires are straight, and if they are not, I'm going to fix them before I go on. Pull your row 5 down right beside the previous row of beads. Give it a nice little tug, pinch them in, mold them in closely together. Pinch and hold that row in place. Bring the lacing wire around the back side of the row and loop around the front and to the back again. Then we're going to wrap row 5 also at the bottom wire. We got a 90-degree angle wrap, so we're going to cross over the front of that bottom wire at a 90-degree angle. Measure your beads directly right in front of or just partially on top of that bottom wire without going past. Use my thumb as an anchor and wrap around the back and to the front again. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly with these next rows. I've got row 6 here, a lace midway. Row 7. Row 8, row 8 right there, and then row 9, again, I'm going to check and make sure that those beads are sitting on top of that bottom wire to cover it completely. I don't really want them to be exposed like that. That little wrap there at the bottom wire is going to show a lot more on my finished seed pod. So I'm going to lift up, push those beads down so that I can cover that bottom wire with my rows of beads. Now if you need to while you're lacing, you can flip it over and look at the back. Sometimes I have a hard time getting my lacing wires straight if I don't flip over to the back side. So if that helps you to make sure that your lacing wires are straight across the back side of your seed pod, you can flip it over to lace looking at the back side if you need to. Just a little tip there for some people if they're having trouble with the lacing wires. I messed up on I forgot what rows I'm counting. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I've done 5 rounds around the basic row. That means I have 11 rows right now. So this is row, well, this is row 11 right here. Row 11. You're going to have even counted rows on the left side of your basic frame, and then odd counted rows are going to be on the right side. Alright, so this is the last round of beads that I'm doing in this color. So this is row 12 right here. 90-degree angle wrap at the top. And then row 13. It does get a little bit harder to line up your rows properly the wider that they get. So just take a little bit more time. I've been doing this for a long time, so it looks a little bit easier when I'm doing it. My hands know very well how to make this wire do what I want it to do. Again, around the back, I'm going to lace row 13. And then wrap row 13 down at the bottom. I'm going to double check and make sure I've just counted properly. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 on this side, 6 on this side, 1 down the middle. That means I have 13 rows right now. And the next 2 rows are actually going to be made in our edging color, which is color F. So what we're going to do here to switch colors is we need to estimate the amount of wire that we need to make the outer 2 rows of beads. And I do that just by pulling out some bare wire, make sure it's nice and straight. And I'm just going to kind of wrap it loosely around the outside of my petal or seed pod. And then I'm going to go a couple inches down past that bottom wire there and cut off of the spool. If you've still got beads strung onto your spool, make a little loop there in the end. And let's see, how many beads do I have left over? I strung 17, and I've got about 4 inches of beads left, so I only used 13 inches of beads there for rows 1 through 13 for a large seed pod. Now that amount might be a little bit different for everybody, so always string a little bit extra. But if you do run out of beads, what I just did there to estimate the wire for the last 2 rows is exactly what you'll do. If you don't have enough beads strung onto your wire, you can just wrap a couple more times around for how many rows you have left and use that to estimate the amount of wire that you need, and then string more beads on the end. Alright, so now we're going to string color F onto the end of our wire. And let's see, I don't know the exact length here. Let's test that out. My notes did not say exactly how many beads I left, so I usually just eyeball it. So that looks to be about enough to wrap around the outside of the leaf. Now once I've got my beads on my wire, I can make a little loop in the end so that those beads don't fall off. And then I can continue wrapping the last of my rows. So we've got row 14 on this side. And because this is the last row of beads on this side, we're going to double wrap the lacing wire. So I'm going to loop around once, and then again. And I'm kind of pinching and holding with my thumb. Sorry, it's a little off there. Kind of pinching and holding with my thumb to, one, mark the spot where I want the wire to go, but also to help hold that row in place so it doesn't move around before I get it completely secured. Alright, so I've double wrapped that lacing wire there on that side, and then I'm going to wrap row 14 at the top wire. Now let's wrap this last row of beads, row 15. We're going to bring that row of beads down the side. I'm going to take a minute to make sure that everything is lined up properly. And I want the rows of beads to be directly beside each other. I'm going to pinch and hold that row of beads together with all of the previous rows to help hold tension on that row and also to help hold it in place while I'm lacing. And then I'm going to double wrap the lacing wire on this side as well to finish off the lacing wire and make sure that it's really secure right there on those edges. Now if you need to, you can use pliers to reach in there and grab that. My lacing wire is getting a little bit short. If you need to use pliers to reach in there and grab the ends of your lacing wire to help you lace, you can. Alright, then we're going to finish off row 15 down there to the bottom wire. Now our pattern says that we need 2 bottom wires total. So what we're going to do is we're going to double wrap this working wire right below that last row of beads so that we get a little kind of a coil right there below the last row of beads. And because we need 2 bottom wires, we've already got 2 here in the bottom loop. That means that we're going to remove this working wire just by cutting it directly against right where I've wrapped off that last little piece of wire. Okay, now I'm going to cut my lacing wires off. I just flip it over to the back, so I'm looking at the back. This is what the back side of your seed pod should look like. This is where you'll see all of the wire wraps where we went around the back side of the top and bottom wire. So if you're ever confused as to which side is the back, it's the one with all the wires exposed. The front side should look like this. And also your lacing wire should also be showing only on the back. And then if you've used a matching color, it won't show so much on the front as it does there. Now to cut off the lacing wires, I put my wire cutters kind of flat right against the back of my row of beads and then snip it off right there. If there is a little tail of wire sticking up, I usually use my thumbnail, but you can just use a pair of pliers as well to kind of tuck that little end down. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Now I've already got my wire twisted down here about an inch. I'm going to go a little bit further, I think, to make the stems for the leaves. So somewhere about an inch to an inch and a half of twisted wire there right below your rows of beads will be fine. Twisting the wires together here makes it a little bit stronger so it can support a little bit more weight. If you leave them individual without twisting them together, a lot of people do that to help keep their stems nice and less bumpy. But they're also reducing support when they do that. So when you twist them together, it does make those little wire stems a little bit stronger. But then I'm going to open up this bottom loop. I'm going to cut over on the side so that when I open them up, my wires end up to be 2 different lengths. Now this top wire here, normally with the basic frame you would cut it short and then fold it to the back, but we need to add some beads to the top here to make that little protrusion at the top of the little seed pods. Now, I'm going to use color E for my little extension at the top there. It's not a big deal if you use color F. Both will work just fine for Lunaria. So I'm going to add 3 of color E to that top wire, and they're just going to sit right there at the top of those rows of beads. And I'm going to fold the wire right above the beads, and I want the wire to be kind of flat against the back side of those beads. So we're bringing that wire down behind those beads. And you do want to make sure that it's not visible from the front, so make sure that you are directly behind the beads and not kind of off to the side. Now this next part is a little bit hard to do to pinch and hold. If you need pliers to pinch and hold this for you, you can. I'm going to use my hands because that's what I'm used to using. So I'm going to grab right there on those beads, and then I'm going to take that top wire and I'm going to wrap 1 full rotation all the way around right below that bottom of those 3 beads that I just added. So I'm going to go around the front and to the back. So make a full wrap right there below those beads. And then I can flip over to the back. I'm just going to cut that top wire off right there, right below where I wrapped. And you can use pliers to kind of push down the little tiny tag of wire if there is one there right below where you've wrapped. Now this part is where you might need some pliers for. We do want this wire right here behind these beads to be really flat against the back of them. Otherwise, the little top bead especially can kind of start folding up and try and make it into a loop instead of a column like what we want. So you can use your pliers to very carefully squeeze right there to flatten out that wire. Sometimes it tries to spin around, so it's kind of annoying to do, but that way you can flatten that wire more so against the back of those beads so that they can't wiggle around as much. Alright, so there is the finished large seed pod, which when made in the correct colors will look like this. Now let's take a look at the smaller sized seed pod. To make the smaller size seed pod, you will need to string somewhere around 10 inches of color E onto your 24 gauge wire. You're going to start with a 6 bead basic row, the same size as the large seed pod. The major difference here is that we have a smaller number of rows. We only have 13 rows across, so you'll wrap around the basic row 6 times. Now rows 1 through 11, or the first 5 rounds around the basic row, are going to be made in the color E, the white beads, and then you'll measure and cut wire for the outer row of beads just like we did before. Just wrap bare wire around the outside and go a couple inches past the bottom wire. And then you'll string color F to make rows 12 and 13. You will again reduce to 2 bottom wires down here at the bottom. And then you'll add that 3 bead protrusion right there at the top. Now some of you might be really happy about this next little note here, this little difference with the small seed pod. You do not actually have to lace your small seed pod. You can leave off that 30 gauge wire that you sewed across the back there. Now, you don't have to lace them, but you can. If lacing as you go helps you to make your rows nice and tidy, you can add a lacing wire in there. It's not going to hurt anything to have the lacing wire on there. So, lace if you want to. If you don't need it, leave it off. I mentioned in the notes, if you're looking at the PDF, that you can work this pattern with a 26 gauge wire instead of the 24 gauge. 24 gauge is the standard that we use in French beading. But if you have like arthritis or carpal tunnel or any other issues with your hands, 24 gauge wire might be a little bit hard to work with. So you can, with this pattern, substitute a 26 gauge wire, which is a little bit softer and easier to work with, and it'll work just fine. However, 26 gauge wire, because it is softer, does not have as much strength or support to it as a 24 gauge wire. So there are a couple of adjustments that you're going to want to do to make sure that your wire is strong enough to hold up the weight of your seed pod. Now what we're going to do here is I've wrapped, this is a small seed pod here, so I've wrapped rows 1 through 11 with color E, and I'm getting ready to measure the wire that I need to make the last 2 rows on my seed pod. So I'm going to wrap that wire around the outside kind of loosely there, but I'm going to give myself a little bit extra length, a couple more inches past what I did with the 24 gauge wire. Now this is technically is 24 gauge wire. I'm demonstrating the 24 gauge wire, but this is what you're going to do if you're working with 26 gauge wire. Okay, so we're going to go a little bit further past so you have a longer tail wire, and then cut off your spool. So I would go probably 4 or 5 inches past that bottom wire. All right, then you'll add the beads that you need for your last 2 rows. So I'm going to quickly string those. Okay, and then I'm going to wrap my last 2 rows of beads. And I'm still going to double wrap right at that bottom wire after my last row of beads. Now the difference here is that we need to have 3 bottom wires if we're working with a 26 gauge wire to get the same support as 2 24 gauge wires. Now, in order to get 3 bottom wires, we're going to twist the working wire into these 2 bottom wires. Now, you could just twist that in there, but we're actually going to twist the opposite direction, so you're going to get a really lumpy stem if you just twist it in the way it is now. So what I like to do is if there are any twists there in my bottom wire, I'm just going to untwist them. And I'm going to try and straighten them out. Now after I've untwisted those wires, I'm going to bring my working wire down right over the top so that it's nice and even and parallel with the other wires in the bottom wire that I'm twisting all together. That just helps me to get a smoother twist. Now I have these little previous twists already in my wire that are kind of wrinkly there. If you want to, you can take some nylon jaw pliers and straighten that out if you want to. I usually don't, but if you're having a really hard time getting a nice smooth twist there, that's something that you can do to help improve your twists. Alright, so make sure that your wires are parallel. Now because we're twisting this bottom wire in the opposite direction of the twists that we originally started with, we're going to pinch and hold right here at the bottom of our leaf to make sure that we don't untwist anything up here. So pinch and hold there, and I'm going to grab about an inch below, and I'm going to kind of pull downward and then twist, pull, and twist until all 3 of those wires kind of twist together like that below the bottom of my little seed pod. And I'm going to open up that bottom loop, and I'm going to make sure that all 3 of my wires are trimmed to different lengths. That way they end at different spots on our stem after we assemble them. All right, so that's the only difference there, is that you're going to have 3 bottom wires instead of just 2. And again, that's only if you're working with 26 gauge wire.